Please be seated. Well, good morning, St. Margaret's. Very blessed 17th Sunday after Pentecost to you. It's so good to be back after being away last weekend at our diocesan gathering of clergy. I had a great weekend. It was a good time to be with colleagues, to worship with colleagues, to do the business of the church. But it's good to be back. And I'm especially thankful to Mother Sarah Maypole, who led us last week, both as our preacher and our presider. We were blessed in more ways than one with her presence in our midst. So I thought I'd start off this morning with some kind of recent news from the world of faith. I don't know how many of you saw this, but over the past few weeks, a couple of, I think, really rather important studies have come out related to the state of Christianity in America. And I'll just say at the outset that the news is not great. First, Pew Research Center, which is kind of the gold standard of polling the faith lives of Americans. Pew Research Center recently published a study about the declining number of Americans who identify as Christian. According to Pew, if current trends continue, if they hold steady, fewer than half of Americans will be Christian by the year 2070. Just as a point of comparison, as recently as the 1990s, more than 90% of Americans considered themselves to be Christian. This is a dramatic change in the religious landscape of our nation. Second, Ligonier Ministries, which is an evangelical Christian ministry. It recently published what they describe as the state of theology. According to Ligonier, 38% of evangelical Christians in the United States believe that religious faith is a matter of personal opinion, as opposed to something like truth. Even more shocking, according to Ligonier, 43% of evangelical Christians now deny the divinity of Christ, which of course is one of the foundational doctrines of the Christian faith. I'll admit, these figures from Ligonier, they surprise me, especially when you consider the group that they were polling. Now, of course, those of us in the Episcopal Church, in the main line, we have not been immune in any way to these trends. And while we often tell ourselves a story about how a smaller church maybe can be a purer church, it seems that these two studies, taken together from Pew and Ligonier, it seems that they don't bear this story out. As a matter of fact, I think it's kind of the opposite. I suspect that one reason for the decline of Christianity in the U.S. is because of failures on the part of the church to proclaim the gospel and the relevance of the gospel to our lives. All too often, we in the Episcopal Church have fallen victim to what Notre Dame sociologist Christian Smith describes as, quote, moralistic therapeutic deism, end quote. That's a mouthful of a term. You may or may not be familiar with it. If you're not, I'll lay it out for you. Moralistic therapeutic deism, as Christian Smith understands it, refers to what is now perhaps the dominant religion in the United States. It's a set of beliefs. It's a set of beliefs rooted in a rather transactional view of faith. And this set of beliefs, they run something like this. First, God wants us to be nice and moral. Second, the point of life is to be happy and to get what we want. And third, taken together, this is what we surmise. We surmise that God exists for the sake of humans. That is, God exists to help humans to be nice and moral and happy and to get whatever it is they might happen to want. Broadly speaking, moralistic therapeutic deism is unconcerned with ideas like sacrifice and lament, hardship and grace. And the upshot, the practical result of moralistic therapeutic deism is that it creates the kind of faith that may feel good for a season, but rarely, if ever, can see us through the trials and tribulations of the human existence. And if it's the case that most people have in mind moralistic therapeutic deism when they think about Christianity, well, I can't say that I'm surprised that the church is getting smaller year by year. I share all this with you not only because it's important to know and to understand, but also because I think it's actually very relevant to us as we seek to understand this week's gospel text. Now, this is another week with, I think, a tricky passage. This is not a straightforward exchange between Jesus and the disciples. And it's another week where understanding the larger context is vital to being able to understand what's going on. I mean, think about it for a moment. This request that we heard just a moment ago from the disciples to Jesus, Lord, increase our faith. Yeah, at first glance, it's a harmless request, right? Faith is a good thing, and the disciples are asking for more of it. If anything, it seems like Jesus is overreacting. He's misreading the situation. Better yet, it just seems as though perhaps there's more going on here than what we might realize at first. Okay. Understand why. We have to understand the chapter as a whole, and this request from the disciples is not included in this week's lectionary reading, but it comes right after an exchange between Jesus and his disciples about forgiveness. Jesus commands his followers not simply to be a people marked by forgiveness, but to be a people marked by radical forgiveness. The kind of forgiveness that Jesus has in mind far exceeds what the disciples were imagining. And so, like so many of the commands from Jesus, what Jesus is doing is he's instructing his followers about how serious it is to be obedient. What Jesus expects from those who follow after him is serious. It's challenging. Oftentimes, the words and commands of Jesus, they can almost seem like a burden. And it's in response to this command from Jesus that the disciples ask for more faith. And the reason they do that is they're thinking about God in transactional terms. In the disciples' mind, they think of faith as like a spiritual currency. It's something we offer in order that we might please God. And if there's one thing the Gospels tell us time and again is that the disciples are interested in compensation, right? The disciples, throughout the Gospels, they're interested in honor and prestige, and even to sit at the right hand of Jesus Christ. They're interested in compensation, and so they want more of the currency. Lord, increase our faith in order that we might follow you. Jesus, though, as he is throughout the Gospels, he's not interested in any of this. According to Jesus, faith is not a spiritual currency. It's a source of life. In that sense, faith doesn't even belong to us, so to speak. No, like every good thing, faith itself is a gift from God. And it's one of the fundamental ways in which God moves in our world. And that's why Jesus uses these words to describe faith. It is otherworldly. It's something so powerful that it can uproot a tree and send it crashing into the ocean. It's all because faith, it's not something that we muster up in order to please God or to be compensated by God. It's something that we cultivate in our hearts, in the deepest recesses of our souls, like a tiny seed, in order that we might be utterly transformed. Brothers and sisters, what I want you to hear from me this morning is that faith can't help but change things. Faith changes us. It opens our hearts to God's redeeming love. And it's what we receive from God whenever we go looking for it. But we have to look first. Again, our job is not to do or say or to be anything in order that we might draw near to God. No, our task is first to draw near to God in order that God might do great things in and through us. That's why Jesus shares this image of the servant coming in after a long day's labor. Hopefully the puzzle pieces are starting to fit together. I have to admit, there may be no more subversive text in all the Gospels than this short 100-word story from Jesus this morning. This is a profoundly countercultural text. It goes against the grain. It might have bothered you a little bit this morning. After all, like I mentioned a few minutes ago, the dominant religion in the United States is moralistic, therapeutic deism. And that religion teaches that we are at the center of our universe. It teaches that we are what really matter, us and our desires, what we want, what will make us happy, what it is we're convinced that we deserve. But the reality is this: that way of thinking is disastrous. It leads us astray. It leads us astray in more ways than just one. Communities simply cannot flourish when they are filled with individuals who are committed only to their own self-fulfillment. They can't. They can't. First, our interests will conflict. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but at some point, individual interests conflict. And what we're doing as a nation is we're seeing in real time what it's like to live in a culture that's positively allergic to negotiation and compromise. If we are all masters of our own universe, how do we possibly figure out whose way is the right way? Second, another problem with this way of thinking is that it's such a distinctly American way of thinking. We are too quick to forget that not everyone in this world is as blessed as we are. Not everyone in this world is blessed to just chase after whatever it is they might desire. Life can't possibly be about getting whatever it is that's on the horizon, whatever it is that's next, because most humans in human history have not been afforded that luxury. Finally, and most importantly, to consider ourselves to be at the center of it all. To consider life to be this thing about meeting our every last desire. Well, that way of thinking forgets about the reality of grace. My brothers and sisters, transactions will only get us so far. Even the most independent, the richest, the most powerful among us, at one point or another will stand in need of things bigger than himself or herself. We all rely on gifts. love and joy, faith and peace, healing, hope, forgiveness. The very breath in our lungs, each of these things are gifts. So the reality is this, and what I want you to take away is this. God is not just another being in our universe. God is not just another party for us to negotiate with. God is not just another way for us to transact our lives. God, rather, is the one who created us and the one who alone can redeem us, who alone can heal us. This is why Jesus asked the disciples whether any of them would thank their servant after a day's labor. It's because God isn't in our debt. God doesn't owe us thanks. God does not owe us even the desires of our hearts. And I know that's hard to hear. God doesn't owe us the desires of our hearts even when we're convinced that we've been nice enough or moral enough or faithful enough to deserve them. And it's all because of this simple fact. God does not transact. God only gives. And the question for us this morning is whether we will receive. I'll go ahead now and I'll close with this thought. There's one final gift that I want to talk about. It's kind of the last piece of the puzzle for us to understand and to grasp this interesting and challenging text. Now, this piece of the puzzle, it comes to us from John chapter 15, fourth gospel. In John chapter 15, Jesus is in the midst of a final meal with his disciples on the night before his arrest and his crucifixion. At this meal, the disciples are in a liminal space. They're confronting a moment when 3 years of ministry, 3 years of triumphs and setbacks, 3 years of miracles and mistakes, well, they're coming to an end for the disciples. They're entering into something wholly new. Jesus, of course, he sees all this, and he invites the disciples into that new space there in John 15. And as he offers this invitation to the disciples, he says something that's actually rather astonishing. He tells his disciples that he's no longer calling them servants, but friends. The miracle of the gospel, the miracle of this text is this. My brothers and sisters, we may not deserve friendship with God, but we're invited into it. We're not meant to expect or demand friendship with God, but we're still offered it. And it's all because of grace. Grace does not compensate, it transforms. Grace doesn't demand, it receives. Grace doesn't ignore or downplay or deny. It forgives, it redeems, and it restores. May we each seek after this grace. May we each seek after this God. And may we know the joy of being both servant as well as friend, doing our duty while embracing a love that can't help but transform us. Amen.